and to provide tools that y'all can use to impact the thinking of others. So those are my goals. Now, just a thought I had. Albert Einstein and physicists and cosmologists, they've been working for 100 years to find the grand unification theory that will explain everything. Okay, a set of mathematics that will tie thermodynamics and electromagnetics and physics and quantum theory and all that all together. And they can't find it. Well, they've left God out, so they probably never will. But I've come to the grand unification theory for what is going wrong in our society. The thing that is driving everything in the wrong direction in the Western civilization. And this is it. We have lost the awe of who God is and what he's done. If we could just get that back in the people around us, everything else starts to fall in place. They start to wonder who that God is, what he's done for us, how he can love us so much, wanting to know and serve and accept what he's done for us. Now, what has caused us to lose the awe of God as a culture? Well, I think it primarily comes down to two things. You don't have to train a little child to have awe in God. They are born with it as soon as they start moving around. Little 1- and 2-year-olds that see a butterfly or a flower, they inherently and immediately are in awe of the beauty and the wonder and know there's something behind it. You don't have to train them in that. But they lose it. Half of the equation is we have allowed an education system that pretends God has never been involved. It absolutely denies the magnificent, enormous acts of God. The first being creation of all life in different kinds. 10 times he said he created animals to produce after their own kind in the first chapter. And the whole universe and all the matter and energy. We totally ignore that death and disease and everything that's wrong in the whole biological, physical universe is our fault. Because we rebelled against God, and if God not cursed creation and brought death into it, we would have lived forever and been forever separated from a holy, just God. Forever, for eternity, separated from him. So he has to, as a just God, bring judgment. Or it violates his very character not to do that. He's holy. But then he brought that judgment upon himself because we can never be good enough. We can never be perfect enough to be with God. And he knows that. And he knew it before he created the foundations of the world. And then the whole world denies there's ever been a worldwide flood. So they're guaranteed to misinterpret the time frame of the past, the rock layers of the past, the fossils and the things we dig out of the ground. They're all going to be misinterpreted because they deny that. And as a result of all that, generation after generation, increasingly so, loses this awe of who is behind it all and what he's done. That's only half of it. The other half is that we do live in a fallen world and it beats us up. Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulations. We will have loved one dies. Highly likely, either you or your spouse are going to be standing on your spouse's grave at some point. We're going to die. We're going to get a disease. We're going to wear down. Babies are going to die. We live in a fallen creation. We have financial problems. We have relationship problems. We have work problems. We have health issues. All of it. It just beats us up, wears us down, and we lose this awe of who God is. So that's what this talks about, the awe of God. How do you get it back? Well, I normally would spend my time in Genesis. It's the greatest creation book of the Bible, although creation comes up throughout the Bible as an important issue. I'm going to take you to the second greatest creation book to deal with that second issue, how the world just beats us up. And that's the book of Job. It's the second greatest creation book, and we're going to get to that before we're done. Job is considered by theologians the oldest written text in the Bible. And Moses penned Genesis probably about 3,400 years ago, that time frame. And it contains things that go clear back to the beginning of the universe, okay, the foundation of where everything came from. But where did he get that knowledge? God could have just divinely given it to him, But I think there's a more logical explanation. Adam walked daily with God in the Garden of Eden and communicated. And I'm sure they talked about just all sorts of stuff. And God told Adam where everything came from. He would have told his sons, who told their sons. And by the way, the life of Noah overlaps with the sons of Adam. Adam's sons were still alive when Noah was born. That's because they lived so long. So Noah would have taken all sorts of information and probably documents with him on the ark. They would have been treasured, valued, and protected, and I suspect they could have ended up in the hands of Moses. So that's a very logical understanding for where that information came from. But the book of Job also contains incredible scientific insights. That's a whole lecture in and of itself. It talks about the earth hanging upon nothing. That was written about 4,000 years ago. We hadn't been able to really discover that until a couple hundred years ago. It addresses the issue of pain and suffering, which is what I'm going to end with. And it provides an ultimate solution and hope to the pain and suffering we will go through in this life. And it's just fantasy to pretend we won't. Now, the book of Job talks about him. It says Job had 7 sons, 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, thousands of camels, ox, donkeys, many, many, many servants. He was like the Bill Gates of his day, or the head of Amazon of his day. He was the richest man in the entire area. And God also said, look at Job, a man who loves and follows me, righteous above all others on earth. God chose this man to go through the worst agony probably any other human being other than Jesus Christ has ever went through. First of all, he lost all of his children. All 10 children just immediately died. I can't imagine losing one of my children and the pain that comes with that. But all of them in an instant are gone, dead. Then he loses all of his wealth. He is penniless with nothing left. All of it is wiped out, and God is allowing this to happen. Last, he comes down with a disease that is so painful from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, covered with breaking, oozing, bloody, pussy, incredible, painful, itchy boils and sores. So bad to relieve himself, he scrapes himself with a broken pottery just to get a relief from that pain by having another pain. And you get the indication it's going on day after day, maybe week after week. And then, probably the greatest test of all, for the next 32 chapters, 4 associates come and try to convince Job that if he would just do things better, if he'd just done things right, if he'd have just not sinned in any way, if he'd have been more perfect, these things wouldn't be happening to him. In other words, works salvation. You want to be saved from problems and stuff, just be a better person. That was the greatest test of all, because that is what Satan uses to draw every human being away from trusting God and what he's done for us. Because we can't save ourselves. And Job refused to listen. Now, in the midst of it all comes what I love. It's kind of one of my favorite verses of the whole Bible, okay? Theologians, based on Job's age and the things that were probably going on, they place this within probably 500 years of the flood. So there's not enormous numbers of people, but population's growing. There's millions of people on the earth at this point. And so we're talking 2,000 years before Jesus walked upon this earth, and Job makes this statement. Well, first he says, naked I came from the mother's womb. In the midst of all of this, naked I will leave. The Lord gave me what I had. The Lord takes away. Praise be the name of the Lord. In the midst of incredible mental, emotional, physical, financial pain, all at the same time. And in all this, Job did not sin. And then he makes this statement right in the middle of this long dialogue. As for me, I know my Redeemer lives. A Redeemer means someone who will redeem us, who will bring us back into fellowship, who will make things the way they ought to be. Okay? A Redeemer lives, and he will stand upon the earth at last. So Job knew Jesus was coming, and that was his hope and faith in the midst of all this pain. All right. Now, 34 chapters of deception going on, Job refusing to buy into it because he knows what the truth is. But Job keeps saying, why am I going through this? I wish I had never been born. This is too much agony. I can't take it. Why are you allowing this, O Lord? Why are you doing this to me? God never answers that question. What he does in the longest monologue of God in the Bible, Jesus has lots of sections, but they're always with questions and answers and stuff in the middle. This is a 3-chapter monologue by God. He starts by saying, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if you have understanding. And then he goes on to talk about the animals and the stars and the laws and how things came about and the care he took, and even spends 2 chapters talking about things that sound exactly like dinosaurs. And at the end of this description of God describing his power and his might and his nature by pointing to Job, things he's seen and knows about, Job makes this statement. He's talking back to God. I know you can do anything. No one can stop you. But I've heard of you before. So Job knew God. He'd heard all the teachings. He knew all about God. But after this monologue that God is revealing to Job, and I don't know if it was in a vision, I don't know if it was to his mind, I don't know if it was audible, but we're told no one can see God as a sinful human being in his presence and not die. So I don't think God was standing there talking to him, okay? God said, now I have seen you with my eyes. And I've highlighted that. And in response to really understanding God's character, the response is always to realize our nature and how fallen we always are, repenting in dust and ashes. So he didn't see God. Why did he say that? This is an Old Testament confirmation of a New Testament truth. In Romans, it says we can know the very nature and power of God by observing what he's made. In the Old Testament, God just described what he's made. And Job said, by looking what you've made, it's like I've seen your power and nature with my own eyes. I've connected with it. Now I'm going somewhere with this, okay? Here's kind of the lessons. Oh, by the way, I love how Job ends. Kind of the next to last, or the third to last verse, it says, so God restored things. Not just restored them, he doubled them. He blessed Job with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, 1,000 donkeys. That's twice what he had before. He doubled everything. And then he gave him 7 more sons and 3 daughters. So he gave him 10 more children. Now the question is, if God doubled everything else, why didn't he double his children and give him 20 children at the end? No, I'm serious. It's a serious question. If you think about what is being said here, if God had doubled Job's children, it would be like saying those 10 that died don't exist anymore. They are non-existent. He did double Job's children. When we die, our soul and our spirit isn't gone. It isn't wiped out as if it never existed. Just our physical body is gone. If God had doubled them, it would be like they never existed. You understand when David's son died, he quit mourning and started rejoicing because he said, now my son is with you. We're not dead when we die. We just walk through a door into another reality, which is way more real than the fantasy we often live in this world. So here's the lessons from Job. Pain and suffering are not caused by God. We brought it on ourselves. And it's the only way we're not going to live forever and be separated from God forever. And God will allow it. And he will use it. And it tells us that in the Old Testament. God will take what's meant for evil and bring it for good, use it for good. Trusting God during our times of suffering will be rewarded. They will build our character. They will build our perseverance. They will build our strength. They will build our empathy with others going through the same thing. They will bring us closer to God. He'll use it in all of those ways if we allow him to. Job ends by reminding us that this life is not all there is, and we're not just gone when we die. And lastly, focusing on God, and the easiest way to do that is to focus on what he's made and gain that awe of these things he's created back, of his creativity and the wonder of it all, and help it move it past focusing on ourselves and our problems. Now, it's easier said than done, but what a book. Oh, man, I am so glad God put that book in the Bible. So, what I'm going to do, that's all background. I'm just going to take time and look at 6 examples of things God has made. And I'm not going to focus on the big elephants and tall giraffes and all the commonly talked about creatures that creation speakers often talk about. But I kind of went looking for unique stuff. And by the way, these devotionals, that is probably the most popular part of them. They're just filled, the biology sections are the longest because they're filled with all these animals. And every one of them are in the various books that I'm talking about. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is the Japanese pufferfish. Now, the narrator, as you watch this little video, he calls this creation's greatest artist. Okay, now, that's an artist? He's just kind of an ugly-looking little fish. Well, you're about to see what he builds. And when I show this video, I just did this last week. I showed this video to a bunch of 5th and 6th graders. And when it got to the part where the camera pans out and shows what this little fish has built, you could hear an intake of breath. It was like, oh, that's the awe of God. And the fact that we let it be trained out of us is just tragic. So watch this little video, and then I use it to point out how we can absolutely know God did it. And the explanation given is just absurd, that it could have just somehow figured out how to do this. So here's the first example.
Unfortunately, this small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He plows the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the bridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this? If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Now, that little film's part of a bigger film by David Attenborough. He's an avid atheist and evolutionist, and he has to explain that. And that's why he throws in at the end that if this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will. Because they have to explain, why does that fish do that? Why does it expend all that energy and effort, 24 hours a day, 7 days, to build this perfectly circular, beautiful sculpture? And by the way, no human being can do what that fish does. It shoves around sand with its head. It doesn't fly up to even look if it's making a perfect circle. It just keeps working and working and working. That would be like that little 6-inch fish, if it was as tall as us, making a perfect circle from here all the way to the street out in front of the church without ever getting up and looking at what you're making. No human being could do that, but that fish can do that because it's been programmed to do it by God. And it's beautiful. Now, does it do that so it can attract a babe? So it can get a girlfriend? It's like, whoa, this guy's a great artist. I better come lay eggs in his nest. Is that why it does it? Well, that's what all the textbooks say in one way or another about all these different things around us that we see are beautiful. Matter of fact, here's a quote by Charles Darwin. He said, the sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, when I gaze at it, makes me sick. Why would he say that? Because Darwin had lost his awe of who God is. He was trained as a theologian to be a pastor in a church, but he went on to travel the world and was influenced by others to come up with this explanation that leaves God out in 1936. And for the next 30 years, he sat on this whole idea of evolution and how just little changes one animal into another change over millions of years until his little daughter died. His 9-year-old daughter, Annie, died of some disease, and he was just devastated. And he thought about it. God, if he existed, why couldn't he have saved my daughter? Why didn't he heal her? Matter of fact, the rock layers are millions of years old, and they're filled with death and disease and bloodshed. They're not millions of years old. It's just how he'd been trained. And it's always been around. We find dead humans way down in those rock layers. For hundreds of thousands of years it's been going on. So if God exists at all, long before people ever appeared, there was death and disease. So God must have just made things that way. It's like ridiculous. I don't even believe God exists. Darwin wrote thousands of letters over 20 years trying to convince these other scientists all over Europe that evolution was a fact, because it wasn't just immediately accepted. And in many of those letters, he said, my goal is to kill God. That was the goal of the man who popularized this idea that everything just made itself. An alternative to the awe of God. But he couldn't explain beauty. Why are things so beautiful? Well, since then, others, for over 100 years, whenever things are beautiful, they say it's beautiful because the beauty serves a functional purpose. Like, that's beautiful, so a female will come lay eggs there. And students are told that. So it's just accepted. We're told flowers are so colorful so that they will attract insects, until we found out insects are colorblind. Okay? Well, we tested this idea. Peacocks are gorgeous with the iridescent colors in those eyes so that the male can attract a female. About 15 years ago, some researchers decided, let's cut off all those beautiful feathers. So this male peacock was pug ugly. He was one ugly dude, okay? No, just stalks up there with no color. Then they sent him out into a field with a bunch of really good-looking guys. So you got the good-looking guys, they're just strutting around, and you got the pug ugly guy, he's just strutting around. And then they sent in the females. It didn't make a bit of difference which one they chose. They chose the ugly one just as often as the good-looking ones. Every time we test evolution, it's wrong. It's not true. And it directly contradicts what God has told us. Beauty exists because it reflects the nature of our God and our Creator. So He can get an appreciation for who he is. That's why it exists. That's why there's fish with gorgeous colors 10,000 feet below the ocean level where not a photon of light ever reaches it. But they still have all these colors because he knew we would find them someday. That's example number one. Example number two, and I love this guy, is the marine sea iguana. He does something there is no other animal on earth can do. No other vertebrate with a pumping heart and a circulation system can do what this guy does. Now here's the backstory. Frank, I'm going to name him Frank, he lives on only one island in the South Pacific, and the island is surrounded by reefs, and there are sharks all around the island because there's lots of food there. But the thing these guys love to eat are these sea iguanas because they have to get their food out of the water. They go in the water and eat fish. So they don't eat vegetation. So the problem arises because this guy's like about 5 foot long. His heart's about that big, about half the size of my fist. And underwater, you know, it sounds like bum, 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 bum. You can hear it really well. Sound travels through water really well. Sharks have lousy eyesight, but really good hearing. So Frank and his brother are sitting there on the shore, and George goes swimming in to get a meal, and whomp, a shark just eats him. Here's his heart, you know, bratwurst sandwich. Yum. He's gone. And Frank's thinking, oh, man, if I go in the ocean to get some food, I'm really hungry. The sharks are going to eat me. But if I don't go in the ocean, I'm going to die. Man, what am I going to do? So this guy does what no other animal in the world can do. He turns his heart off, shuts it off. No heartbeat. Then he goes in and he swims, sounds just like water swishing around, grabs all sorts of food. Okay, here he is swimming under the ocean. And his heart's not beating for up to 20 minutes. You know, just eating the little fish. And there's, you know, the heart isn't pumping the blood around. It's not getting the oxygen out to his muscles. It's not getting the oxygen to his brain. But he's just perfectly fine. Then he crawls back up onto the land, and he dies. Because he hasn't evolved the ability to turn his heart back on yet. I mean, who amongst us can turn our hearts off at will? This guy can, and then he turns it back on. You see, there would have to be thousands of changes to his DNA code in his body, the ability to get oxygen there without the heart pumping, the ability to withstand long periods of time with less oxygen, other mechanisms to move the blood around, the ability to turn it on and then turn it off and then back on. All of it all has to be there all at once. Because if anything piece is missing, as soon as he figures out or causes it to shut down, it's not going to restart. It's all got to be programmed in. See, those are the things we see where everything has to be in place that should give us this awe of God in this rock-solid, foundational assurance it couldn't have just made itself. So we should be looking at who is this God. Why aren't we sharing these things with kids in every school and presenting them in this way with all the problems of how could just a little step change at a time have created the whole system? Now this one I love. He's my superhero, my favorite superpower of all these superhero guys. Now, this is a little thing called a sea sapphire. It's only about 1/4 of an inch long, so just hold your thumb just a little bit apart. And he's a brilliant sapphire blue color. Now, the reason you see color, and I'm looking at someone out here with a bright red shirt, the reason his shirt's red is because light comes down from the ceiling, hits his shirt, bounces off back into my eye, but all the other colors of the spectrum are absorbed, and red is reflected. And then I'll see red. Or I'll just pick your color or your combination of colors. Well, this guy, all the colors are reflected back from a source or absorbed except for blue, and it's reflected back. Now, his body is made up of a series of scales on the outside, translucent, almost transparent, just little panes of glass. And they're set apart from one another, like a butterfly's scales. So there's a set of scales, and down below it there's another set of scales, and there's a gap in between the two. So the light will pass through that first glass-like set, it'll hit the second set, absorb all the colors but blue, and blue will bounce back. Except When that creature turns, there's a path length, okay? If light's coming from above, it's passing through, hitting the cycle and bouncing back. When that creature turns, now the light coming straight down, it's a longer path length, and the blue also gets absorbed at the bottom of the second scale. So now none of the light bounces back. It actually will pass right through the creature, and then the light coming from the bottom will pass up. So you could see the bottom of the ocean through the creature. His whole body is also a transparent fluid. He becomes invisible. When he turns, he disappears like he's invisible. God invented the superpower of invisibility and gave it to this creature. Now watch this little video. And it's on a loop. It's going to go a bunch of times, but he's just floating there. When he turns and then shifts back, you'll see him disappear. You'll see the ocean underneath of him. So that's what he looks like. And here he is, and he just turned. You see that? Watch it. When he turns, you can see right through him. He literally disappears. And then you're seeing the ocean underneath of him because none of the light's reflected back. Isn't that cool? You're seeing just light reflected off the bottom of the ocean. God invented invisibility. Ah, the wonder of it all. Now think of an engineer assigned to create a structure that you can see it totally perfectly solid, and as soon as you turn it at an angle, you can see right through it as if it didn't exist. And they would spend billions of dollars trying to figure out how to do that. And all of the knowledge and technology and engineering and skill that would have been involved into it, it would take. Okay, so that was number 3. Here comes number 4. I love this bird because he's not called the bar-tailed evolution wit. This is the bar-tailed godwit, and he does what no other bird in creation can do. This guy, in the summer, lives in Alaska. That's where he spends his summers because it's a smorgasbord of food up there. All the whales head up there, the shrill head up there, the plankton bloom in the spring up there. But when it gets to be fall, he realizes he's going to freeze to death. He better head down to the south, to Florida, except he heads a lot farther. He flies 7,000 miles over open ocean with no islands and no land to get all the way to New Zealand. Now, that's pretty cool in and of itself because the babies do it too. The parents will lay eggs. They'll leave first while the kids continue to eat, and then not even following the parents, never having been there, they fly 7,000 miles to hit this little pinpoint in the middle of the Pacific Ocean island. And they know how to get there. How does that happen? God programmed it, okay? Now here's the issue. It takes them between 5 and 7 days, 24 hours a day of flapping their wings because they have these long spindly legs, and if they get tired and land on the ocean, they can't take off like a seagull out of water. They will drown if they land. They can't land. They've got to keep flapping and flapping and flapping and flapping day and night, day after day after day after day. Well, even putting aside the idea of how tired our muscles would become, scientists, they're pretty smart. They can. Part of the tool of science is figuring out how creation works. So we know how many calories it will take to move a wing of a certain weight through the resistance of the air, and it'll burn up so much energy. And they know how much fat are in these birds, and they discovered that it is absolutely impossible for those birds to fly that far. They're going to run out of energy, and they're going to nosedive into the ocean, except they don't. Well, that's kind of interesting, so they kept studying it. How does this bird do that? Well, it turns out, before they take off for a couple weeks, I weigh about 180 pounds. They eat and eat and eat and eat and gorge themselves. It would be like me 2 weeks ago weighing 180 and 2 weeks later weighing about 250. You know, I'm going to have fat hanging off my chin. I've got a huge old stomach and just putting on all this weight. So now they look like the Goodyear blimp. And they can't fly very good. They're really lousy aerodynamic shape. And they still aren't going to be able to get that far. So next, they eliminate all the water from their fat. So the fat turns into this real hard, like beef tallow. It doesn't have a lot of water. It's a real hard, concentrated fat without all that water weight. But they're still too big. So right before they take off, like the day before, all of their internal organs shrivel up. Their kidneys, their stomach, their liver, their intestines, they all just squished paper flat. And then that fat fills in those cavities, and all of a sudden they become really streamlined again. And for 7 days, their body just uses up all that fuel in order for them to get there. Isn't that cool? It is amazing. Now just think of all the changes that would be needed. If all those things were programmed in as a biological program for that specific bird, the first birds that took off to fly to New Zealand, they would just die. It would be the end of the species. See, again, God makes the truth absolutely obvious. The mechanisms of evolution, just ignore the problems and assume it just all made itself. And then they get there. Probably not. And there is a lot of evidence, and by the way, it was just mentioned up here, I'll repeat it. Before the flood, we don't even know for sure what the world looked like, but there's all sorts of evidence that those continents that we now see have moved into position. The question is, when did it happen and how fast did it happen? To believe in evolution, you have to assume it happened really, really slow like we see it happening today. But things had to have been happening very fast during the worldwide flood. And it doesn't violate any laws of physics. It just requires the right conditions to have caused it to happen in very rapid ways.
It just shows that God is such a caring
He does.
that He would, in essence, reprogram that.
He either reprogrammed it or he put it there knowing it would be used later. And all the time, organisms, they have abilities that kick in when they reach certain environments. And it's assumed to be evolution, but the much better explanation is it's just programming that wasn't needed, and the environment itself has allowed it to manifest itself. And bacteria do that. They adapt, but they adapt because they're programmed to adapt. Now, example number 5, and this deals with getting this wonder of who God's done, who he is and what he's done in front of people. And I mentioned it last night, I've started producing these little 2 to 3 minute videos, and they correspond to pages with all the different devotionals. I get together with my videographer about twice a year, and we film a couple dozen of them, and I've made 66 of them so far. And I want to show you one of them. And it deals with how God has cared for us by putting things in creation that will benefit all of us. And there's pages in the book that deal with that. But this one deals with a little slug, and what can we do with a slug's slime? And it's just kind of a fun little story. But this is what these little, without a doubt, we can know without a doubt that God exists by looking at his creation. But here's one of them. You know, God told us to take dominion over creation in the book of Genesis. That means to study, understand, and control it. Now, why? Because we can learn so much from it. I mean, we can even learn from a slug. A slug, you say? Yeah. It turns out that there's a certain kind of slug that lives in northern Europe that slugs, when they move, they leave a slime trail. It's just kind of a sticky, gooey, watery thing. You can actually see their trail as they're crawling along. Well, scientists started to study this slug from Europe, and they realized their slime is very, very elastic, which means you can stretch it and it'll snap back, and very, very sticky. Now, for years, scientists have used things like super glue to bind up wounds, and they thought, it's a little toxic and it turns a little brittle. What we need is a really flexible glue that will stay sticky. And they discovered this slug slime and thought, these has the perfect characteristics for glue. Now, don't get too excited about, having some slug slime slapped onto your cut, because it takes a lot of slugs to form enough slime to fit the market. And, slug slime farms aren't exactly practical, because the slugs only exude this kind of slime when they're scared, because they don't want birds. Like if a bird's flying overhead, out comes the sticky slug slime glue. And if the bird comes and tries to pull the slug off the sidewalk, it's stuck to the sidewalk. So the only way to get the sticky glue is to scare the slugs. And slug slime farms aren't exactly practical. I mean, you set up a movie theater, you put all your slugs on the seats, and you show them movies of scary birds, and then you scrape the slug slime sticky glue off the seats. I mean, not exactly practical. So what do? They figured out how to synthesize it. And we now have the formula for sticky slug slime glue that is currently being used to seal up wounds. Isn't that cool? Because we figured out what God did first. So we can learn from creation, develop products that benefit us in a multitude of ways, even slug slime glue. What a slugger of an idea. So just sign up for that. They come out every couple weeks, and then forward them to other people. It's putting God and who he is and what he's done in front of people. That's our job. He does the rest. Two more quick examples, and I got to wrap up. The Opu fish. I use this in all these South Pacific countries because they're familiar with fish. Well, that little fish I showed you is a saltwater fish, but it has to lay its eggs in fresh water, like a salmon. But the only source of fresh water for large area, 100 miles, is this waterfall that comes down, and then it flows immediately out into the ocean. So if the fish lays its eggs at the bottom of this freshwater waterfall, they're going to get flushed out into the ocean. There'll be no more fish. It has to lay its eggs at the top of a 440-foot waterfall that just plunges down through air into a plunge pool at the bottom. Now, how's the fish going to get up there to do that? I'll ask the students, and they'll say, I've heard of a flying fish. Maybe it's a flying fish. Well, flying fish don't fly. They just have specially designed by God wings that aren't wings. They're just fins that allow them to jump and glide for up to 100 feet and maybe get 10 foot off the surface of the water. It could never get 400 foot high. How about climb? Like Spider-Man? Another superhero? Well, no, not like that guy. Turns out this fish climbs with suction cups on its stomach. God designed a fish with a little suction cup on its stomach so it can stick itself to the stone wall, shove, stick, shove, and over a period of days, it will climb 400 foot up, jump in the water, swim upstream, lay the eggs. They'll hatch, grow into little fishlings, and then get flushed back out into the ocean, and then repeat it again. I mean, evolution? I mean, suppose a fish is like born one day and it's got a suction cup on its stomach. It's like, Mama, what's this thing on my stomach? She isn't going to know. Well, maybe I'll go stick myself to the wall and climb 400 foot up. Well, if it needed to do that, it would have died before it ever had the suction cup. And if it didn't need to do it, it's got this thing flapping around that's going to be a real disadvantage, and it's not going to survive very well in the ocean. See, everything has to be there all at once. The design and the need for the design. Now, here's what I'm going to wrap up. There's this thing called chemiluminescence. And by the way, all of us, we're familiar with it. We can buy these sticks that if you just break it and you mix the two things together, all of a sudden light is given off. And you can get them in different colors. And the nature has the same thing. There's jellyfish that glow blue. There's plankton, and there's no lights on this beach. The plankton, when it hits the beach, gives off some brilliant blue color, billions of them. It just lights up the whole beach. There are mushrooms in the Amazon. You're walking along, and there's these glowing green mushrooms. Plants, animals, microorganisms. There are squid that are literally billboard light show, where they have chemicals mixing together in rapid fire sequence where you'll have greens and blues and oranges and reds streaming across their back like a billboard, just changing constantly as they swim along. Here's that animal that lives 10,000 feet from the surface of the ocean, and it has a light bulb on a stalk at the end of its nose so it can attract other fish. Now, all of these are different lights with different wavelengths, and they're different chemicals. They're all varieties of a classification of chemical, and when it was discovered back in the 70s, they finally analyzed it. The chemist who figured out what those two chemicals that these animals are mixing together, he called one of them luciferase, and the other one he called luciferine. And when you mix luciferase and luciferine, you get light. Anybody note the root word of those two chemicals? Lucifer, the angel of light. Isn't that interesting? That's what he chose. He was probably a Christian. But it happens, they've discovered 38 completely different classifications and animal bodies or plant bodies or types that mix chemicals together to form light across the globe, and none of them are related in any way that they can figure out. They have to assume the ability of these animals to make, manufacture, hold separate, and bring together two very complex chemicals happen 38 times totally independent of any other animal. It's absurdity. It is so clearly designed. And the one we're most familiar with is a bug that God put a light bulb on its butt. Now think about that. God stuck a light bulb on the butt of a bug. Why would he do that? It could have survived other ways. It's just to get us to be in awe of who he is. And if God can put a light bulb on the butt of a bug so he can light his way, don't you think he can light the way out of your problems? I mean, think about it. We're the ones who fellowship with him. In the final verse is something God tells us. We who have accepted what he's done for us in salvation. So we've been grafted into his family. We become again his children, where before we were his enemy, before we accepted what he's done for us. That's the language in the New Testament. We're the children of light. We're the children of the day. We're not of the night and the darkness. That's how he described the Pharisees who refused to accept God's salvation and wanted to earn their own way back into salvation. They were living in darkness. Their father is the devil, says Jesus, where he is our father once we've accepted what he's done for us. Distinct, separate groups. So let us who are of the day put on faith and love, and not just the hope, I think, but the very the assurance of salvation. In the book of John, John says, I write these things to you that you may know that you are saved. Not just wonder or hope. You can know. If you've never felt that change where you have a desire to obey and follow God, that's where I think we need to work out and test our salvation to make sure it's real. Make sure there's been that change in your life and you're indwelled by the Holy Spirit, because we can know. So that's the message, the awe of God. Don't lose it. Help other people to regain it and point them toward the greatest awe of all, that God would become a human and die in our place. So thank you. That's the morning's message. And that's not even the sermon. Yeah, thank you.
All right, we're going to take...